Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hey, lovely radicals. Merritt here, but not really here. Before we get to today's interview, you will hear a generic announcement that will stay the same for the next few months, so bear with me. As most of you already know, I am currently offline for the next few months, as I have made the very hard decision to go to residential treatment for the first time at the age of 44. I don't know how long I will be gone, maybe 3, maybe 6 months, so who knows. All I know for sure is that the facility I'm going to is very, very strict with internet access and generally what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And it was asked of me to really focus on my own healing and not continue, doing interviews and working on the podcast all the time. So there's that. And as uncomfortable as this is for me, it makes complete sense, of course. Yet, since I have quite a backlog of already recorded conversations that I wouldn't want for you to miss out on, since my guests were such gems and you really just need to hear what they had to say, I had to find a way to bring them to you while I'm away. My decision was to record all the intros beforehand and get everything ready before I go so that I can post them whenever I can. We will see how it works. And because I don't know how often I will be able to check in on Facebook, in our community, or other social media, I have decided to let a group of great people take over for the next months ahead. So please don't expect me to post or comment as much as I did. I know I will be online only very infrequently, and I won't be able to respond to emails or messages. Just know that our community on Facebook called Life Unrestricted is in the hands of wonderful experts and generally great, kind people who know about recovery and who are there for you. So rest assured that the space will be as safe as it's always been. And who knows, just when you least expect it, I might be able to pop in and say hi every now and then. As I said, who knows? That's probably the phrase I use most frequently these days. Who knows? Who knows? I really don't know anything. So for now, all I do know is that I want to bring you all the episodes that I have already recorded. And once I run out, well, who knows? We will see about that when the time comes. As for all of you lovely Patreon supporters who are still willing to contribute to this show on patreon.com/lifeunrestricted, know that you are always in my heart and that I'm eternally grateful for your support. As I cannot give any actual shout outs to the latest contributors anymore because these intros are pre-recorded, I just wanted you all to know that I love your support and that I'm super happy to have you. And for those of you who are interested, as I said, the link to my support platform is patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. Every pledge you are making is happening on a no strings attached basis, so you can cancel anytime. Thank you, all of you, for being you. And now, showtime. Today on the Life Unrestricted podcast, you will hear my follow-up conversation with Dr. Michelle May from Phoenix, Arizona, that we promised to have after our great round 1, which was episode 56. In case you haven't had a chance to listen to that one yet, I highly recommend it to you. Michelle is a former physician, mindful eating speaker, and recovered yo-yo dieter who founded the Am I Hungry company that offers mindful eating programs and training. Am I Hungry empowers people to end chronic dieting and overeating and to get back to a fulfilling life without deprivation and guilt. She is also the award-winning author of the book Eat What You Love What You Eat. Based on the success people had with her first book, Dr. Michelle May wrote and published 3 more books: Eat What You Love What You Eat for Diabetes, Eat What You Love What You Eat for Binge Eating, and Eat What You Love What You Eat for Bariatric Surgery. Her books, programs, and retreats are all designed to help people increase self-awareness of beliefs, habits, thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations to finally understand why diets do not work, to discover simple yet powerful methods for knowing when, what, and how much to eat without restriction. Since finding her passion in helping people end their dieting traps, Michelle has retired from her medical practice to focus fully on sharing the mindful eating method. Along the way, she has been featured on countless media outlets and publications, and her personal story is even featured in Chicken Soup for the Dieter's Soul. After our last talk, Michelle and I agreed to have this round 2 because there was still so much left to be said at the end of our recording time, so to say. So we scheduled a follow-up where we could dive a little deeper into some specific topics and special cases she comes across in her work. So I'm very happy to finally be able to bring this episode to you. It is one that is for all those cases that are not usually commonly talked about much in the realm of intuitive eating. Hi, Michelle.
Hello.
Thank you for making the time today and for being my very first comeback guest on the Life Unrestricted podcast.
So glad to be with you, Merritt.
Yeah, it was great. When we spoke last time, it was episode 56. We talked about why diets don't work, the vicious eat, repent, repeat cycle, guilt, regret, how diet culture influences us and makes us grow fearful of foods or food groups, and nowadays especially carbs and sugars. We talked about so many things, but I don't think we got into the backstory why you started the Am I Hungry programs in the first place and why you wrote the book, Eat What You Love What You Eat. So I think we have some catching up to do there. So take it from there.
Well, I think like you, my passion for this and my passion for helping other people really comes from my own struggle with this. I started dieting at a pretty young age. I had some body image concerns at a young age. You know, parents that say things, not necessarily cruel things, but things that stick with you, and then comparison with friends, and even 30, 40 years ago, there was still media and increasing media exposure to these different things. And so somewhere along the line, I just got the idea that I was not acceptable the way I was. And like many of us, that really began my first diet, which continued on. I cycled through those diets for many, many, many years, developed a significantly disordered eating pattern.
How did that look like for you?
Well, for me, it's what I now call the eat, repent, repeat cycle. I would be on my diet. I'd be doing really well. Well, I was making air quotes. I know you can't see them, but I was making air quotes about doing well. What I mean by that is my perfectionistic tendencies meant that I was checking the boxes and counting and weighing and measuring and following all the rules. And as long as I was following the rules, I felt good, again, air quotes, good about myself, good about what I was doing. But inevitably, and I mean inevitably, there was always a slip. There's always going to be a slip. And my black and white thinking, my dichotomous thinking meant that if I made a mistake, then I'd blown it and now I was bad. And so I might try to compensate at first. Maybe I would skip a meal or do something else to try to compensate for that. But it always ended up spiraling downward into a binge that then eventually would require me to go back on my diet, go back into restrictive mode. I really didn't understand that is the nature of disordered eating. I didn't understand back then that diets themselves cause this effect in virtually all people. That's really why I ended up doing this work, is because we have to give people a different way of thinking about food, a healthier relationship with food, and begin to put food back in perspective in our lives. Because for me, the dieting, I was over dieting the same way I would overeat. I would use dieting to manage my emotions. And for me, a lot of times it was about control, right? I wanted to control my life. I wanted things to be just so. And of course, that's impossible. I recognize now that control is always an illusion, that we are never completely in control of our lives, that inevitably stuff is going to happen, things are going to come up. But back then, because I didn't recognize that control was impossible, I would blame myself if things weren't going right, or I would shift my attention to controlling my eating instead.
A lot of people don't realize that diets don't work for this exact reason, that, we're being sold the first part of the diet, how to successfully lose X amount of pounds in X amount of time. But no one tells you that, there's repercussions to that on the metabolic side, on your psyche side, and on the binge, the very physical part that really is belonging to the diet package. And they don't tell us that. So we go on diets, and then when the binge happens, or when we start to get weak or irritated or something goes off, we blame ourselves because everybody looks so successful, on the cover of the magazines. We go like, if she can do it, then I must be able to do it.
Oh, it's such an illusion. It's such an illusion. It's a big fat lie. And I think, maybe there are some people out there that don't know that that's what happens and are promoting these things and they're blaming us when it doesn't work, right? I think there's some of those, but I think we have to just acknowledge that, as you said, it doesn't work for the vast majority of people. So why we hold on to this belief that this is going to be the diet? And I know what it is. I mean, I know it's because temporarily it feels like it works. Temporarily we have this sense of being in control, which is especially powerful if you've also struggled with that feeling of being out of control. And so this idea that maybe if I just do it right, or maybe I'll try a different plan. Or nowadays, and I know you and I are kind of on the same wavelength about this, is nowadays there's become this sort of epidemic where it's not even just about weight loss, but it's about health. People think they can... Yeah, healthism. I need to do this because of my health, or it's justifiable, or what are my options? And I think that we especially people like myself who are at risk for disordered eating, I think that this idea that I'm doing it for health reasons can be a justification for trying to control all of our eating and control our lives in order to feel good about ourselves and feel worthy. And I think so much of this really comes down to the core of unworthiness, this feeling that I'm not enough. And if I can just attain this shape or size or perfection in my eating, that somehow then I will be good enough.
Yeah.
And if the pain in that is that it never works. I mean, it never lasts. It never leads to that feeling of worthiness. And now what do you do? Mm-hmm. So,
and that's exactly the problem with OA, thinking that if I just stay abstinent. And I've encountered so many people who, after years of OA and silently struggling and blaming themselves, are finally getting out of that. And also, all of the food tribes that, as you said, promote this healthism idea, either being, I don't know, raw or keto or paleo or vegan. And people get themselves into a rut, belonging to this new tribe and then justifying maybe even very negative health consequences to themselves because now they belong to this tribe and they maybe experience some sort of community, just as women often do with diet talking and exchanging recipes. And now it's paleo recipes or vegan recipes, and you end up Googling all this stuff all day and how to go keto. It's very dangerous, and it's very much not how we're designed to function.
And it's distracting. I mean, let's face it, this idea that I'm going to spend this disproportionate amount of my time thinking about food or not eating food and exercising, it really is way out of proportion to the benefits that you might get. And I think so much of what I'm seeing has gone far beyond health and really into the realm of a distraction, of really an obsession. And what's the point of being healthy? Which, again, I agree with you. I don't think that often people even attain the health that they're seeking. But what's the point of trying to be healthy if you don't have any time or energy left to actually spend time with people you care about or do things that you love to do and enjoy your life, right?
Yes,
I mean, what's the point of that?
I so relate, all the missed birthday parties because there's cake, can't have that.
Right.
And not going to any social functions anymore because, food, or, I can't exercise, or what do you mean there's no gym in that hotel, so I'm not coming?
And then the shame that comes when inevitably it's too difficult to follow it perfectly or consistently. And then there's this additional shame because, as you said, it appears that everybody else is doing it or everybody else is having success. Why am I not able to do that?
Yeah. And then it brings huge anxiety to change ingrained habits again. So, but back to your story, you were telling us about how you were stuck in this eat, repent, repeat cycle where you thought, oh, if I'm not doing this diet right, or if this binge happens, then obviously I need to control this whole thing harder.
Yeah, it's a big lie. Of course, I can see it now. I really can see it now. But back then, I have boxes of Weight Watcher meeting notes. I wrote a blog post about this a while back because I'm thinking, why did I save these? Like, what was the point of saving these? And of course, I haven't dieted in almost 2 decades now, and I still saved them. And I realized that the reason I saved them is that I wanted something to show for all the time and money and energy that I had invested. Like, it was the only concrete thing that I had that was proof that I had tried, right?
Oh, yeah.
Even though, isn't that sad? I mean, I think it's really sad to think. And I looked at those and I could see days that I wrote down things like 2 lifesavers and, counted it in, give me a break, 2 lifesavers, really.
Yeah, I get you.
It's so disordered to look at it now. And it makes me sad for the time that I wasted on that. But I will say, for me, because of the work I do, I am really grateful for the insights and the understanding and the compassion that I really feel toward people who are struggling with this. Because I'll tell you, the thing is that the dieting started when I was in middle school, junior high school. I dieted on and off all the way through high school. I did it in college, and I was still doing it when I went to medical school. And, here's the irony of it. I mean, medical school is probably one of the most challenging academic situations a person could be in. And I was successful. Again, there's my air quotes. I was successful in that realm. So the fact that I couldn't do my diets perfectly, that should have been a clue to me that maybe I wasn't the problem, that maybe the whole concept of restrictive eating was really a flawed premise in the first place, that it isn't really designed to create lasting change or, again, air quotes, success, that it really is by its very nature destined to fail for most people.
What happened after that? What made you wake up?
I went into my medical practice and I met a lot of people who wanted advice, who were asking for help with these same issues. In some cases, they had medical issues that they were looking for help with. And what became really clear to me is that it wasn't just me, who was struggling with this. And I saw it so often, and I saw it in people who, again, were having success in other areas of their lives, their careers or their families or their schooling or whatever it was. These were clearly competent people, as I was. So why was it that so many of us were going down this same road over and over and over again? And so that was part of the wake-up call, was just, wait a minute, it's not about finding the right diet. This isn't working for people. Unfortunately, and I apologize that during that time I sent a lot of people to Weight Watchers because that was my diet of choice. I didn't know better. Many physicians still think it's a, air quote, good diet. But it is a diet, and I just didn't realize yet what kind of harm it was causing. Another piece for me was then having children. I had my first baby and then my second, and I observed this beautiful, organic, natural joy with eating. They would touch their food, they would taste their food, they ate whatever they loved, they didn't worry about it, and when they were done eating, they would just get up and run off and go play. It wasn't like they just weren't obsessing about food, and I thought, this is so messed up. Here, these young children have this joyful, natural relationship with food. And here I'm the one who's thinking about it all the time and struggling with it all the time. And it was really clear to me that somewhere along the line, I must have forgotten how to do that. Like there must have been something or things, probably multiple things, that caused me to forget my instinctive ability to love food that way and to also feed my body in a way that was not so obsessive and disordered. So I think those are probably the two biggest pieces for me that really led me to stop dieting. And at first, I can't even tell you, it was crazy. I decided I wasn't going to go back on this diet again. I was, due to, because I'd failed again. And I considered going back again. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that this time. I am not going to. And I will tell you, it was amazing to me how within a really short period of time, I stopped obsessing about certain foods. I stopped binging on certain foods. It's almost like the diet was giving all these foods so much power over me.
Did you re-allow them and give yourself permission to eat them?
Well, that was a process. Mm-hmm. That was a process. I mean, initially it was, I'm not going to diet and I'm not going to restrict and count and weigh and measure these foods. And so then I would eat them and I would forget that I had some left and I needed to eat all the rest of it. Like I would just notice myself not being that way. Now, the problem is that around this time I decided that I wanted to do something more helpful for my patients in terms of this, and I didn't really have the understanding yet of what was going on. And so I went to a conference that was for physicians who wanted to help their patients with weight loss. And because at that point, this was 20 years ago, at that point I thought that's what I was doing, was helping myself with, managing my weight. I called it weight management. And I sat there in that conference for 3 days and I heard all of the same crap that I had been doing for years, and they were promoting it and they were teaching how to do it and telling people. And again, they weren't being malicious about it. They truly believed that this was helpful. And I thought, I just wanted to stand up and scream, stop, you're not helping people. Mm-hmm. You're making the problem worse. You don't know what you're doing or what you're saying. And then there was a business session where I'll just never forget this. The instructor said, it's really important that you're really kind and gentle with your patients, because when they gain the weight back, you want them to come back to you.
Wow.
I was like, oh my gosh. So you do know that what you're teaching doesn't last. You do understand that, don't you? And so I left that conference and I ripped up all my notes and I vowed that I would never, ever, ever be involved in a restrictive program like that again. And so then I found a psychologist, a registered dietitian, and an exercise physiologist, and we began to build a program from the ground up that was, at the time, what I was calling a non-diet program. And so it was really just about saying it doesn't exist. What I want to teach people doesn't exist. And so we built it from the ground up. I later learned that there were a few people out there that were sharing this message, but I unfortunately hadn't come across them yet at that point in my journey. And so
there was no internet back then.
There was no internet. Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I actually needed to hear that, because I was thinking, why didn't I? Why didn't I know?
How could you? Yeah.
Yes. And you're right, because since the internet has really expanded the awareness of this, but it's a double-edged sword, because at the same time, it's also made other pseudo experts and other forms of restriction, it's also allowed them to flourish too.
Yeah.
So we've seen both the non-diet movement expand, but at the same time, some of these others have really blown up too.
Yeah, you're right about that. And so you started that program and then you wrote the book?
Yeah, so I started the program in 1999, and initially we were teaching workshops. I actually rented some space in a doctor's office next door to my office, and I was just teaching these workshops on my half day off or in the evening, and I still was in my medical practice, still seeing patients during the time. And then we revised the workbook again and again. And as we worked with people and we learned what resonated for them, and we sort of began to really understand more and more about what we were doing and what was helpful, we kept revising the workbook. And by 2004, I decided that it was time to write an actual book, to really go in and write it down and make it available. So that was my first book. It was called Am I Hungry? I eventually rewrote that book and took that book off the market. My company's name is Am I Hungry, but I took Am I Hungry off the market because it had a lot of still subtle diety messages in it that I couldn't see when I first wrote it. This is such an evolutionary process. Like, we start from what we know and we filter everything that we learn through what we already believe. And over time, you learn and you grow and you explore and you expand, and things are just constantly evolving. I mean, my understanding of this work has evolved significantly from where it was when I started. And so eventually I wrote Eat What You Love What You Eat. And that really for us has been our cornerstone book. The process there is what we use in all of our books and all of our programs, and really trying to apply these concepts to people who are in different situations or have different struggles or different needs. And so it's really become my life's work. I finally left my medical practice in 2006 to do this full time, because I now know that this is what I'm on this earth to do. And as I said before, I'm in a way grateful for my disordered eating past, because it really has helped me be able to do this work in a very authentic and compassionate way.
Yeah, that really came across when we talked in episode 56, and I strongly advise all the people who are interested to go back and listen to that, because we have a lot of backstory there too. And I think this today is for all the cases that you get or got along the way. And there's a reason why you wrote subsequent books. So I think today we're going to delve into some of those cases where people came up to you and said, well, Michelle, your eat what you love what you eat concept is great and everything, but I cannot do that. I cannot eat what I love because ... And you got a lot of those along the way, didn't you?
Yes. So many people, because there's a misunderstanding about this idea of mindful eating or intuitive eating or non-diet, that there's two options. You are either eating everything or being perfect. And again, I want to repeat this common thread that I see in the people that we work with is this dichotomous thinking. It's this all or nothing thinking. So many people see it as either doing it or not doing it. So how this became really apparent to me is, as I said, I was teaching workshops there in my own community initially before I started training other people to teach them. And I would sometimes have people in my workshops who have already had bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery. I had people who had diabetes. Being a physician, certainly some people came to me because they had metabolic syndrome or diabetes. And later, I recognized that I had over the years people who had binge eating disorder as well. So I think it really became clear to me that the structure that we use, the paradigm that we use, still helped them, but it needed to be adapted a bit for their particular situation so that we could really, I'll use diabetes as an example. I think diabetes is a good example because there's a common misunderstanding about diabetes, and I hate to say it, but it's perpetuated by some health professionals who don't really fully understand this, or even some of these programs out there that really focus on, well, the common misunderstanding is that sugar is bad and sugar causes diabetes. And even if people don't misunderstand that it causes diabetes, that somehow sugar is the thing that they need to avoid. So this very common misunderstanding. And then more recently, that has been extended to carbohydrates in general. So, carbs are bad and you got to avoid carbs and that kind of thing. Well, it's really clear that if we don't understand really what diabetes is and how it develops and how it's managed, then it's easy to see how people would make that mistake. But the other problem is that so many people that work in this area or who have diabetes don't understand how diets work. And so I gave a talk at a dietetics association meeting, and this dietitian, whose name is Margaret Fletcher, she's a registered dietitian, she's a diabetes educator, and she's the co-founder of the Center for Mindful Eating. And I didn't know all that at that time, but she came up to me and said, Michelle, she said, my patients with diabetes are yo-yo dieters all grown up. And I really had to think about that for a minute. So what she was saying to me as we explored this idea is that many people who had dieted on and off for their whole adult life, at some point, if they were prone to diabetes because of their family history, at some point it would manifest itself in diabetes. And that's not to say that everybody who struggles with yo-yo dieting is going to develop diabetes. In fact, that's one of the misunderstandings and myths about diabetes. I mean, it's just sort of this common misconception that it's weight gain that causes diabetes, and that's just not true. So anyway,
people get diabetes at any weight.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Definitely. If we've made that the cause, then that's what everybody's supposed to try to fix. Well, it doesn't work like that. Then how do you treat somebody who's not overweight who develops diabetes, right? I mean, it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, and diets don't work. So what if someone is overweight? Let's treat the disease and not the weight.
Exactly. And that's really how this conversation with Margaret went, was I said, well, then if they've been dieting all their lives, then what on earth is supposed to suddenly cause them to be able to follow a diet now that they have diabetes. And it's very similar to other diets. When they get a diagnosis of prediabetes or diabetes, they're so afraid, so fearful that they will follow whatever diet they're told, whatever they find on the internet or whatever their dietitian or maybe their doctor tells them to do. So they will follow it rigidly or religiously, just like I used to with my Weight Watchers thing, until they can't. Until a day comes when it's not possible to continue to restrict to that level. And then instead of just going back toward the middle and finding some moderate way of including the foods that they're missing, they go all the way back to the other extreme and then binge or overeat. And so what ends up happening with people who have diabetes is they restrict. Their blood sugar might look better temporarily, and then they overeat and their blood sugar swings all the way in the other direction. You might remember we talked, I believe, about the pendulum in our last conversation.
Yeah, we did.
So that same pendulum that we see with diets, we also see with diabetes, but we have the additional problem of the blood sugar swinging wildly from one extreme to the other. And so then they compensate and then they go back on their rigid diet. Now, let's say that at the same time, their doctor or their diabetes educator or their diabetes team is trying to treat their diabetes. So they might see that their blood sugar has been high and add medications or increase insulin doses. And then the person gets afraid or scared because now they're having to go on higher medications. And so they start restricting again. And then their blood sugar is bottoming out because they're on too much medicine because now they're restricting again. Mm-hmm. And so then they're having low blood sugar. So then the doctor changes their medications again. And so there it goes on and off and on and off. And so they're ending up in this situation where they aren't feeling good and their body is completely confused and their blood sugar is swinging wildly.
Sounds like the worst thing for a body, right?
Absolutely, right? I mean, it's terrible even when you don't have diabetes. It feels psychologically terrible and it feels physically terrible. But if you add on to that diabetes, then it's even more of an issue and can be even dangerous. So what we really did with the program, Migrat and I decided to write Eat What You Love What You Eat with Diabetes, and it's designed for people with prediabetes or diabetes. And we took the same exact concepts that we use with the mindful eating cycle and many of the strategies that we use in my first book where we're helping people understand their relationship with food and start to recognize this. But then we added the additional information, the truth about understanding what diabetes really is. And even though some people are very fearful about nutrition information, what I've found is that if you can heal your relationship with food first, that you can begin to look at nutrition information as a tool rather than a weapon or rather than a method of controlling yourself, but it becomes a tool for taking care of yourself, a self-care method rather than a punitive method that so many of us use up until that point.
So let's make an example. Let's say I have diabetes, I come to you, and the first thing you do is explain the mindful eating cycle to me.
So I don't see people individually, so I do want to clarify that. What I do in my work is we develop programs and we train other health professionals how to use those programs in their work.
Sure.
So let's say that somebody goes to a diabetes professional who has been trained to use Am I Hungry? Mindful Eating for Diabetes program. So they can either work in a group or they can work individually with somebody. But they will help them understand their diabetes not from a fear-based perspective, but to really understand what's going on inside their body and how their body is responding or not responding appropriately to carbohydrates without making carbohydrates the enemy. See, this is the mistake and this is the error that so many people get into is they start to make carbohydrates bad. And of course, if you've been dieting on and off your whole life, that's all you need is that little information that carbohydrates are bad and they affect my blood sugar. And now all of a sudden there you are back in your same restrictive eating cycle. And so it goes. So what we would do instead is teach the mindful eating cycle, help people understand why restrictive eating naturally leads back to overeating, even when you have diabetes, even when you have a medical or health condition, that it still, the restrictive eating cycle will still, for the vast majority of people, will still drive you back toward that eat, repent, repeat cycle. And then we layer in information to help you understand diabetes and diabetes self-management and nutrition from a non-restrictive perspective. So it's not about restricting carbohydrates. It's about understanding what foods are carbohydrates. And if I love sweets and then I also enjoy this thing and this thing, it's possible to figure out how to balance eating for enjoyment with eating for nourishment. Yeah. That it's not about eliminating or limiting carbohydrates. It's about making choices that allow me to have, well, it's a bad pun, but to have my cake and eat it too, right?
Mm-hmm. And how do people react when they had your program? What are the reactions?
Well, I will say, first of all, for many people, it's scary because they have so much experience in their life with going on a diet and then overeating and going on a diet and overeating that they believe fundamentally that there's something wrong with them, that they are out of control around food. And if they let themselves eat what they love, that they will, of course, binge. They just are sure that they're going to binge. But the reason that they believe that is because in the past, the only times they allowed themselves to eat what they love is when they were off their diet. And so they were swinging from one extreme to the other. And so it first takes a little while to help people understand that we're not using a yo-yo model anymore. This is not on or off, that we're switching the model to a pendulum. And it's not about trying to do this perfectly. It's about trying to find the middle. And when you no longer restrict yourself from eating the foods that you love, then those foods gradually lose power over you. And the desire to, or not even the desire, the impulse to binge on those foods starts to go away when you're not restricting them anymore. That's a very scary idea, and it's very hard for people to grasp that concept. And I will say that it's very difficult for health professionals who've spent their whole career teaching people to avoid certain foods or count certain foods or pay penance for eating certain foods. It's very difficult for health professionals to really grasp the idea that eating what you love actually is the solution, not the problem.
Mm-hmm. And it's also hard, to get all the bad information out of our heads, because
yes.
I don't know if I'll ever forget how much calories cottage cheese has, simply because right. That's how my whole dieting stuff started out. It's not something you just can forget because I meet you,
right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's still
right.
there and the fear is still there.
And that's one of the reasons that mindfulness has become such a powerful tool in this area, in this recovery work or in this self-care work. And that is because we won't forget those things because we used them so long that they're just part of our unconscious paradigm. So what mindfulness does for us is that when we notice that we're mentally calculating the calories or the carbs or the minutes of exercise, when we notice it, we go, oh dear, oh sweetheart, there's that old restrictive voice again, just showing herself. We don't need her anymore. Remember, we know how to do this without that. And we can let it go without judging ourselves. If we're mindless, if we're unconscious and we're not using our mindfulness skills, then that little voice begins to take over and it starts to drive our decisions. And we don't even realize what's happening until we're so far down the path that now we're back in the same old cycle again and we don't know how we got there.
That's such a beautiful explanation of mindful eating, because that idea was sold to me, as I said in our last conversation, in a totally different way, namely a diet, eat slower, chew more, and, basically just try and eat less. By eating slower and eating less, it was not really mindful as in be aware of your thoughts and stay in your body.
That's exactly right. So unfortunately, again, getting back to the problems with the internet is that I think some people are grasping onto these words mindful eating and they're turning it into another diet, count your chews, chew each bite 32 times. It becomes very regimented. It becomes very much like any other restrictive method of eating.
Exactly.
And that's not what mindful eating is at all. It's awareness. It's a noticing my physical sensations, both comfortable and uncomfortable. It's noticing the thoughts that are in my head. It's noticing the emotions that I'm experiencing. And when I take an action that has consequences that I regret, then it's being compassionate and gentle with myself as I try to reflect on how that happened rather than beating myself up and judging myself. I can really begin step by step to notice these patterns, because that's really the only way that we can make change. And again, it's not with the purpose of weight loss or being good or following the diet, but it's truly with the purpose of being more curious about why I do what I do and beginning to experiment with new ways of thinking and behaving to find something that works better for me than the old path, because surely this old restrictive path doesn't work for most of us.
Yeah. And I think the most painful part of all this is becoming aware of this critical inner voice that we have, this inner gremlin that says, yeah, sure, let yourself go. You're not worth anything. Or you're sure you're going to eat that? You're going to have to exercise to make up for that? Or all that stuff. Usually we're not aware of it because it's become so second nature. That's the entire narrative we've been fed by diet culture. And all of a sudden, we realize, oh, these are just thoughts. These are, recycled messages that I've been reading or ingesting all my life. So I can do something different. That's an important step to even realize that we can do something against this inner voice. I mean, I wasn't aware that I even had it because it was my head. So what do you mean? I can not be aware. This was just the air that I was breathing, and somebody telling me that my thoughts are not me was very important generally with healing and getting to know myself. So I'm thankful you pointed that out.
I think if I could just add, don't believe everything you think, right?
Yeah, that's the best sentence I've ever heard.
Don't believe everything you think. And again, mindfulness helps us even notice that we're thinking. Like if we're not conscious that these are just thoughts and I don't need to take action on them, they're not necessarily true, then it empowers us to be curious. And I would say it's not even fighting against the thoughts, because really mindfulness is about letting go of resistance. I mean, so much of what we picked up from diet culture was about resisting our impulses and controlling ourselves and using willpower or won't power. It's not about that at all. It's about compassionately noticing what's there and pausing and just, being curious. Well, where did this come from? And I don't know, I just can't overemphasize the importance of the compassion piece here.
Oh, you're doing a wonderful job. So in the end, people who go through your programs with diabetes, they experience a much more peaceful relationship with food, and they can manage their diabetes a lot better.
Absolutely. It's so much about being curious. It's not about following some rule. It's about being curious. Well, when I eat this particular food or this amount of food, how do I feel? What happens if, in the case of people with diabetes, if they're also checking their blood sugars, they have an additional piece of information that they can use for feedback. And again, we have to work really hard with people to get rid of the shame and the fear fear of checking their blood sugar because in the past they've been somehow taught that a high blood sugar is bad, or it meant that they were doing something wrong, and they use it from a judgmental perspective rather than simply an awareness tool, feedback that says, that's interesting. When I ate this happened to my blood sugar. Let me see what happens if I do this instead. And it really puts the person into a curious, kind of fun, playful, experimenting place rather than that fear-based judgment place that so much of diabetes self-management comes from for people.
Yeah, basically they've been fed the lie that you brought this on yourself, so...
So you deserve to suffer.
Exactly. So what are some other cases where people tell you, well, I love your program, but I can't because...
Another common one is people who have had bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery. Some people might know it as gastric bypass, or maybe the sleeve procedure, or another procedure is the band procedure. And so now this is an important population for me because these are people who got so tied into the diet myth that at some point they reached the conclusion that they were never, ever going to be able to heal their relationship with food, and their only option was to have a surgical procedure to change the way their body functions.
It brings tears to my eyes, even when I hear you say it. It's so, so sad.
It's heartbreaking to reach the point of desperation, that we would spend that kind of money on a procedure and pain. And here's the problem, Merritt, is that so many people experience initial, and I'm going to air quote this again, success with a surgical procedure like that. And so inevitably, and I'll refer specifically to gastric bypass or a sleeve procedure where the stomach is made smaller. And so initially there's this, it's called a honeymoon period where
I told you about my friend last time.
Oh, that's right. I remember that now. Yes.
That was exactly it. When she said, why don't you compliment me on my weight loss? Don't you like it? And I was so conflicted.
Yeah. Well, this honeymoon period, it feels easy. It feels like such a relief. And of course, during that time period, everybody's noticing and everybody's commenting except you because you're wiser than that. But they're getting so much reinforcement. And then, of course, other people are seeing it and they're thinking, well, maybe I should do that too. And so it develops this sort of almost mythical proportion of a cure, a miracle.
Yeah, very intoxicating phase.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of putting it. It's very intoxicating, but inevitably when it gets challenging again and then people begin to struggle, then now they're left with different anatomy. Their body is now different. And so when they return to using food for emotional reasons, or, using foods they've been missing, or using foods to soothe or distract, now they may end up having some severe side effects from it. And so initially that might cause them, and in fact, this is sort of what they're hoping for, is initially they may be hoping that they'll have what's called dumping syndrome. It's such a horrible feeling, flushing and rapid heartbeat and sweating and nausea. And it's just absolutely horrible that they're hoping that it will cause them to not want to binge again.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing.
Looking for control.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Terrible that we'd have to feel terrible to gain that control. Mm-hmm. Well, not everybody gets dumping syndrome. So first of all, if someone's hoping that that's going to be the motivator for staying on their diet, that it's not going to happen for the majority of people. I think the statistic is around 30% will have it, about 70% won't. The other thing is that many people can figure their way around it. So they might end up doing grazing, eating frequently small amounts of food all through the day. Or for somebody who's had a band procedure that just makes the opening smaller, they might find themselves drinking shakes or eating foods that are called slider foods that start to be liquefied and digested in the mouth. And so they will find their way around it. We call this maladaptive eating, not because they're a bad person or lack willpower, but because the surgery didn't address the real reason that they were overeating in the first place in many cases. In some cases, it's other issues, but for many, many people, they never really healed their relationship with food, or they had an eating disorder before they had surgery that was never identified, or they develop an eating disorder when they have the surgery. And so I want to be careful here because I do understand why some people might choose this procedure. I do understand that for some people, this is, really a last resort, a last choice. And I in no way judge people for this. Most of them don't even know about mindful eating. They've never heard of it. They've never tried it. They think by the time they decide to have bariatric surgery, they really truly believe they've tried and failed everything. So it breaks my heart. It's one of the reasons we developed the Mindful Eating for Bariatric Surgery program as part of our program, because there are so many people who have had the surgery and go back to struggling again. If I could give you a specific example.
Please do, yeah.
We also, and I'd be happy to talk about it, but we also have a Mindful Eating for Binge Eating program and an Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat for Binge Eating book. And so one of the ways that we work with people is we do these 5-day retreats where everybody comes together and we work together intensively. I bring a therapist and we really get the work started. Well, at one of my retreats, I found out, we hadn't asked the question first, I found out that 40% of the people at that particular retreat had already had bariatric surgery. This is a binge eating retreat. This is a retreat for people who self-identify with emotional eating or binge eating, and yet they've already had bariatric surgery and they're still struggling. So in other words, bariatric surgery does not treat binge eating. It does not resolve binge eating. And in fact, some people will develop other habits. Alcoholism is quite common after bariatric surgery. There's a number of reasons that can happen. We find people who struggle with compulsive shopping. We find people who start struggling with promiscuity or seeking attention from, sexual attention, for affirmation. And so it just it just shows us that there's this hole that still hasn't been filled. And if you take the food away, that hole, may actually feel like even more of a void. So
it's like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. Just a transfer.
Yeah, and I get that some people will finally heal their relationship with food as a result of the surgery when eating for them is no longer an option, or overeating, I should say, or binge eating is no longer an option. They may then be motivated to seek therapy or seek out other tools or other kinds of things. But that's, again, you don't hear about the failure rates of bariatric surgery. You hear a lot about what it can do for people, but we don't hear about the complications. We don't hear so much about what happens a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. And I think really what we wanted to do with this program is teach people the same skills, but they had to be adapted because the body is different. So for example, in our regular mindful eating programs, we teach all foods fit. We 100% wholeheartedly believe that all foods fit into a diet. And I'm using diet in terms of a pattern of eating. I don't mean in any way a restrictive diet. I think it's really important that we be able to make peace with food and eat all foods. Well, here's the problem. somebody who's had a bariatric surgery procedure, all foods might not fit. There are some foods that will
Literally not fit, yeah.
literally not fit, both volume-wise, but also cause side effects or problems. For example, certain kinds of foods, very fibrous foods or tough meats or other things that, we just sort of take for granted, people have difficulty eating. And so what we do is, instead of saying don't eat that, or, that's a bad food, what we do is really talk about what those foods might be and how to experiment and figure out what works for you. So again, it's not about, and it's so much of what's out there in diabetes and bariatric surgery and other things is an outside-in approach. There's some expert telling you what you should or shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. And really what mindful eating is about is it's an inside-out approach. Let me go from the inside out. Let me see what works for me. Now, I might need a little information. I might need a little better understanding about my body or the physiology or the anatomy of my body. And then once I have an understanding of that, then I'm empowered to figure out what works for me.
Yeah. And so how do you teach those workshops?
So one example, let's use the bariatric surgery example. So probably many of your listeners are familiar with a hunger and fullness scale. We use that in all of our programs, helping people become more connected with their own physical sensations of hunger and satiety, and using that hunger and fullness scale to help them identify when they're hungry and when they're not, and to start to know the difference. I mean, they still might choose to eat when they're not hungry. That's part of normal eating, to do that. And then at least they understand that that's what they're doing. And if they're eating for pleasure, then they can choose foods that are going to give them pleasure, and they can eat it in a way that gives them pleasure. Well, people with bariatric surgery procedures, their hunger and fullness scale doesn't look the same as a person who hasn't had a surgical procedure. And so in the workshop, we give them a blank hunger and fullness scale. We talk about how it's used, and then we help them figure out how to draw their own. So for example, many people who've had bariatric surgery might discover that it takes only a bite or two or a couple bites of food to go from feeling comfortable to feeling miserable, like literally miserable. And so they would maybe draw we use 5 as a neutral content position. They might draw their hunger and fullness scale. The 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are really close together rather than evenly spaced the way we might show it or explain it in a program for people who haven't had bariatric surgery. Does that make sense, Merritt?
Mm-hmm.
Am I explaining that well?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Well, it's just about adapting these mindful eating concepts, because as your initial question was, what about people who say, well, mindful eating sounds great, but you don't understand. I can't eat carbohydrates, or I can't eat what I love because I've had bariatric surgery. And I would just say that mindful eating is a universal approach, and I've yet to meet anybody who cannot apply the principles to their own life, because that's the whole idea of the concept. Is it's completely adaptable to whatever struggles you're having, to whatever your own life has brought to you, your own preferences, your lifestyle, your choices in eating. It's adaptable to any of those things. It sometimes just takes a little tweaking.
Yes, and I appreciate, you offering workshops where people actually also meet other people who may have the same condition, like diabetes, or other people who also identify as binge eaters, or other people who also had bariatric surgery. That helps tremendously. Like, you're not being alone with your doctor who says, like, people with PCOS, for example, get the advice you should go keto or restrict carbohydrates and exercise more. And that gets them, into a whole lot of trouble too. And they could all use people in a group that go through the same cycle. And it's easier to trust the program when you are in a group of people who, let's try this together, instead of listening to another doctor who is giving you a restrictive eating advice, and then you're by yourself and you're dealing with your own shame and guilt by yourself. I think
it's so isolating.
Yes.
It's so very isolating, and it's confusing. And when you bump up into walls, which you will, I mean, think about how many years we've been doing it a different way. When you bump up into obstacles or naturally come up against questions, where do you turn? I mean, where do you get that support? So we love groups because so much that can happen in a social learning setting. First of all, you learn that you're not alone, and it helps you be much more compassionate with yourself. The shame and the guilt that's often associated with this, like for our mindful eating for binge eating program, so much of binge eating is a secretive, shameful process that being able to actually bring it out into the light and share the struggles with other people is it just provides a sense of relief and a feeling of self-compassion as you experience compassion for other people. And the other beautiful thing is you don't have to make all the mistakes yourself. You can learn from other people's experiences. We have an online mindful eating support community that I facilitate where, it's such a gift when somebody will come on to our secret Facebook page and post about a struggle that they've had, because we can work through that, and everybody that's in that community gets to learn vicariously. They get to learn from, what the triggers were and how they responded and what they learned and what worked and what didn't work, and also get to observe other people lifting this person up and helping them see that they are not a failure, and that it is possible to turn our mistakes into learning experiences.
Yeah. For people with binge eating or who identify themselves as binge eaters, are they very surprised when they see that a lot of the binges and binging can be tied back to the restriction or the intent to restrict, or the on and off the wagon? Or do they just think that I'm an addict, I have a problem, I need to restrict? Or it must be a huge relief to see what drives the binges and that it's not their fault, and that the cure is very counterintuitive, namely do not restrict.
Exactly. I mean, that's it. I mean, that's the whole thing, is that on their own, most people who and I will say, I heard you say it earlier, and I want to just talk about something really quickly, because it came up at a retreat that I did just very recently, where somebody called themselves a binge eater. And I want to just suggest that we try not to use words like I am a binge eater, or I am an anorexic, or I am, because those are labels that we then kind of take ownership. We begin to self-identify with the behavior, and it becomes our identity. So that's why I like what you said first, which is, a program for people who binge eat, who have struggled with binge eating, because binge eating is a behavior, but once you understand it as such, then you don't have to own it. It doesn't have to be who you are as a person.
You're so right to point that out. It's like I've fallen into the OA trap. I'm an addict, I'm an addict, I'm an addict. And I'm out of control, I have no control.
Yes.
You're so right.
Well, it also came up at our retreat. Somebody said, I'm an insomniac. And I said, would you be open to a thought that maybe you have struggled with insomnia, that you're not an insomniac? She came back the next morning and she's like, oh my gosh, I had the first great night's sleep I've had in 14 years. Wow. Literally just letting go of her identity as an insomniac allowed her, by the very next evening. I said, well, don't expect it to always be like that. But it did create a shift for her, because she was able to see the behavior or the problem as something separate from herself. So anyway, back to binge eating. Yes, it's so eye-opening for people to suddenly realize that the thing that they thought they were doing to solve the problem was actually part of the problem. it's uncommon. It happens, but it's actually uncommon for us to work with people who haven't at some period in their life had restriction as part of their binge, repent, repeat cycle, that they're using restriction to compensate for the binge eating and not realizing that the restriction is actually feeding the binge eating. And in fact, I think for many people, restriction is a very powerful emotional trigger for overeating or binge eating.
Yes, and I would love for you to make the distinction and also pointing out that there's not just physical restriction and how powerful that mental restriction is. Like, I shouldn't be eating that, or I'm going to have those cookies, but tomorrow that's not going to happen again. Because a lot of people, the way I hear it is people say, well, I'm not restricting anymore. And that was Isabel Fox and Duke that talked a lot about this, and she made so much sense. Like, when we're mentally restricting, like I shouldn't be, and this is not going to happen again, that this has the same effect as restricting physically.
Yep. And I think there's a few things that you can look at to notice whether you have, I would call it invisible or unconscious restriction. It's what we were talking about earlier, that these thoughts are so deeply ingrained in us through practice and repetition that we don't even notice that they're there, or they become invisible to us because we think they're part of normal. That's just the way you think about food, right? It's part of normal eating. And in our culture where so many people have disordered eating, it's become normalized. It's sort of the way it is. So a few things to think about is, do I find myself thinking about the foods I don't eat or I shouldn't eat? Am I feeling deprived of certain foods? Am I craving certain foods? Am I preoccupied with nutrition information? Am I overly focused on rules about when, what, and how much to eat? Am I constantly thinking or talking about food, or as you said earlier, looking up recipes for foods that are going to be allowed on my diet? I mean, there's a lot of subtle restriction that takes place, these little voices, the planning for compensation. It's okay, I can have cookies.
Yes.
But there's a big but there, right? But I'm not going to have bread with dinner, or I'm going to spend more time on the treadmill tomorrow, or, whatever it is. It takes so many different forms. And again, mindfulness
substituting
helps
food also, finding the low calorie version, or going for some other forms of finding a lower calorie food instead of going for what we really want. And in the end, we usually eat it all. Like, for years, I told myself I shouldn't have the chocolate, let's say. And then there's yogurt in my fridge. Okay, I'm going to have yogurt. And there's a cereal bar. Okay, I'm going to have that. Or, okay, what could I eat now? And then maybe have some trail mix or whatever it was, or even vegetables, like bowls of vegetables. And in the end, the chocolate was still there. And I was still craving the chocolate. And then I ate it anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the restrictive eating cycle. And that's, one of the reasons, as I was saying earlier, the work transforms over time. And one of the things that happened for me is, like I said, initially when I was doing this work, I thought it was about, a non-diet weight management. It was just a mistake that I made based on my prior experience. What I've come to realize is that restriction takes many, many forms. It's not just about weight loss. Nowadays, it might be about health, it might be about diabetes, it might be about eating local or organic, or, this whole problem that we have in our culture of demonizing entire food groups and types of foods. And that's not to say, Merritt, that once a person has healed their relationship with food, which is always the number one priority, that must always take place first. Once you've healed your relationship with food, you might discover that you feel better when you eat certain foods and, when use moderation with other foods. It's not to say that you won't eventually find some path, but the truth of the matter is that it's that restrictive voice. It's a lie when we start thinking that we're going to, I'm just limiting this because it's unhealthy, or I'm limiting this because I won't feel good. And we're making up our own little diet between our ears that is, as you said, it's this invisible restriction. It's still about denying myself the foods that I love, the foods that bring me pleasure, the foods that ultimately lose power when I have 100% permission to eat them, that I've given myself, not just that somebody else has said, this would be very helpful if you allow yourself to eat what you love, but that I personally have truly allowed myself to eat these foods without guilt, without paying penance, without having to count it or substitute it or any other number of ways that restriction shows up.
Mm-hmm. And I bet you've become an expert at dealing with people's fears when they enter your programs, and you work with your approach and people say, but I can't do this because something terrible will happen.
Yeah, we have a whole chapter called Fearless Eating that's really all about that. And again, it's about, first of all, recognizing those thoughts and those fears, noticing that they're there in the first place. And then I think the theme here is learning to trust ourselves again, recognizing that when we first give up the restriction, that naturally there's going to be very likely some compensatory eating of foods that you've been restricted of. Again, think of that pendulum. It's normal that if you've been holding your pendulum up and trying to be really good and you've been trying to hold it all the way to the right, that if you finally say, you know what, I'm not going to restrict anymore, it's natural that it would swing over to the other side for a little while. And what a lot of people will do is they'll panic. Somebody has given them the impression that mindful eating will stop you from overeating. You won't overeat it. And that's just not true. It's part of normal eating to sometimes overeat food. It's definitely part of normal eating when you first give up restriction, that pendulum would swing the other direction for a little while. And if people can just accept that that's a natural part of the process and not swing back to restriction again, then the pendulum starts to lose energy and it will find a smaller arc in the middle that's perfect for you or perfect for you at this point in your life. It may change down the road. You might find a different arc later as you discover new things about yourself or as things change, as they always do. But for now, you find a way of eating what you love and loving what you eat, and it's not about eating mindfully as another form of restriction.
Yes, and I totally get why in that healing process, it's also important to have some sort of support system so that you don't freak out, because in that phase, that's where I usually fall back. Because I prove my own story right. I can't be controlled around food, or I'm out of control around food, I'm crazy with food, then obviously I'm the exception. And I think what really helps people, and I think would help me too, is just being around other people that, in this process, when the pendulum swings the other way, that you don't freak out and that okay, you're held, you're carried, this is normal. Just go with it and it will normalize. But if you restrict again, how can it normalize? You're holding it.
It just keeps going back.
Yeah.
Exactly. Dr. Carrie Anderson, who is my co-author on Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat for Binge Eating, and she and I co-created the Mindful Eating for Binge Eating program, and she did some research for her doctoral studies on our program. She has this really simple phrase that she uses that I just love, and I would write it down if I were you, Merritt. It says, of course this would happen. If we can just use this gentle, compassionate, well, of course that happens. Of course we would gravitate towards the foods we've been restricting when we stop restricting. Of course we might overeat something that we've been missing. Or of course I'm overly tired and I might find myself reaching for food. Or of course I might be tempted to go exercise this off because that's what I learned before. It becomes this this self-compassionate, the thing that we might say to a good friend or somebody dear to us. Of course you would do that. And it's this compassionate response, this, we call it in our program, the self-care voice, where we're starting to cultivate this self-care voice to balance that cruel, restrictive voice or that overeating binge voice that, that wants to give up and just say, forget it. It's that balance. It's that way of finding the middle in between those extremes of all or nothing, good or bad, doing it or not doing it right.
Yeah. The only thing I have to add here is that we're all worthy of support. And if we can't do this alone, then there's no shame in that. Of course, we can't do some stuff alone when we've been inundated with the wrong messages. And that's also, it's just the only thing. When you talked, all of the stories you said, so much of it comes down to feeling understood and being in a community with people that share some of the experiences or past experiences. That's just so important. So I really appreciate that you're offering those programs, and especially the specific programs where people can really be with like-minded people or people who suffer from the same behaviors or same conditions like diabetes. That's really nice. And before we wrap it up, I just want to hear what you're working on. I hear you have another book coming out. Might have you back for a third time.
Oh, yeah. Well, we didn't talk about Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat for students. I won't spend any time because I know we've already talked for a long time. But I will say that we also took this same kind of concept and applied it to the young adult population, some of whom may not even realize that they're struggling yet, or maybe don't really understand this idea of not restricting. And so I designed a program that can be taught on college campuses. I'm actually teaching it right now at Arizona State University, and I'm really passionate about reaching students before they struggle for decades like so many of us do. The newest book I'm working on is Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat for athletes. And I'm really excited about this because I think this is an under-recognized problem. I think, a lot of people assume that athletes have it all together and that they must be uber healthy and they're doing it all right. But in fact, as you well know, there's a lot of disordered eating and a lot of disordered exercise patterns in athletes that affect their health, affect their, certainly for younger athletes, their growth and development, affects their athletic performance, and ultimately causes them to really suffer and sometimes struggle in silence. So I'm excited about this book.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much for your work. Again, how can people connect to you and your work?
I think the easiest way is to go to amihungry.com. And then if you are an individual looking for help, just click on the Mindful Eating for Individuals tab. If you are a health professional who wants to learn more about mindful eating or even how to offer mindful eating programs in your setting, just click on Mindful Eating for Health Professionals. And then we also have a tab for organizations. So companies, health plans, larger organizations who are wanting to implement something other than Weight Watchers at work for their employees or their members.
And I'm going to ask you the same question as I did last time. Let's see what comes up for you today. What would you like to be remembered for?
I'd love to be remembered for changing the way that we think about food. I want it to not be this struggle, this painful love-hate relationship that people struggle with. And I'd love for us to begin to think about food as a way to nourish and fuel and add pleasure to our lives so that we can really use our energy to do what we love and love what we do.
It was a delight to talk to you again. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. I love sharing these messages, and I love your work, Merritt. It's great that you're reaching so many people.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome, make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.